Have you ever stopped to think about what happens to our digital history? You know, the first websites, the first video games, the first designs ever made on a computer. Well, it turns out saving them isn't as simple as just saving them. It actually requires a whole new kind of science, digital archaeology. So grab your digital trowel, because we're going to start digging.
When you picture an archaeologist, what comes to mind? Probably someone in a dusty pit, right? Carefully brushing away dirt from some ancient relic. But what if the artifacts aren't buried in dirt? What if they're trapped on a 30-year-old floppy disk? What kind of tools do you even use for that?
Well, the answer is a little different. On the left, yeah, that's your classic kit, your trowels, your brushes. But on the right, that's the toolkit for a digital archaeologist. Instead of brushes, you've got these specialized USB controllers like a cryoflux. And instead of maps, you're using custom software to read the magnetic ghosts of file systems that don't even exist anymore.
Okay, so to really understand why this is so critical, let's look at our first dig site. Now, this one's metaphorical. We're going to focus on a truly revolutionary moment in architecture. The exact point when designers put down their pencils and picked up a mouse for the very first time.
This right here is the archaeology of the digital exhibition. And what it does is pinpoint that exact moment in the late 80s and early 90s when a handful of pioneering architects started playing around with computers. And in doing so, they completely changed what it was possible to build.
And you have to understand, this was a massive leap. I mean, before this, architects worked with pencils, rulers, calculators, all very simple, very physical tools. And then suddenly, there was the computer screen, this limitless digital canvas where impossibly complex ideas could finally be explored.
And this just illustrates that shift perfectly. On the left, you see this wonderfully expressive, kind of chaotic hand sketch by the legendary Frank Gehry for a building that was never built, the Lewis residence. But then, look at the right. You see how this software, called CATIA, translated that wild, organic idea into a precise, buildable 3D model. This was absolutely revolutionary. Of course, Gehry wasn't the only one doing this. You had architects like Peter Eisman using computer scripts to generate architectural patterns. Shui Yo was using digital models to see if his incredibly complex roofs would actually stand up. And Chuck Hoberman was creating these kinetic, moving structures that were just unimaginable before computer-aided design. These are the beautiful digital artifacts of that time. But, and this is a big but, here's the problem. While the designs were incredible, the technology they were saved on was, well, let's just say it was primitive and incredibly fragile. We've seen the shiny artifacts, now let's go look at the actual fossils. See, back in the 1980s, the digital world was basically the Wild West. It was a complete Tower of Babel. There were no standards, an Apple II couldn't read a disk from an IBM PC, an Atari couldn't talk to a Kaypro. Every single system used its own proprietary disk format, its own file system, its own secret language. And this leads us to a really shocking paradox. A file that was saved on a floppy disk in, say, 1989 is often way harder to access and way more fragile than a clay tablet that was inscribed 4,000 years ago. Seriously. With the tablet, at least all you need are your own two eyes.
So how in the world do we rescue this history? Well, this brings us to the literal dig, the incredibly painstaking work of a real digital archaeologist trying to coax these ghosts out of the machine.
Now, it's really important to make a distinction here. This isn't digital forensics. That's what you see on TV shows, right? Finding evidence for legal cases on modern cell phones and computers. Digital archaeology is all about cultural preservation, recovering history from old, obsolete media. It's really the difference between being a sleuth and being a scholar. The whole excavation process is incredibly meticulous. First, you never, ever work on the original disk. That's rule number one. You create a perfect bit-for-bit copy called a disk image. Then, you use that special hardware we talked about, the cryoflux, to bypass a normal computer's hardware and read the raw magnetic data right off the disk. I mean, the lowest level of data possible. Finally, you use a whole other set of software tools to translate that raw data back into the files and folders we can actually understand. And really think about this. It's a multi-layer translation job. You're not just recovering a file. You're basically decoding a whole series of lost languages. First, the language of the disk's physical encoding, then the language of the operating system's file structure, and finally, the language of the actual application that created the file in the first place.
So why? Why go through all this trouble? Because this incredibly technical process is the only reason we can see and appreciate those beautiful architectural artifacts we started with.
Look at this. Without this digital archaeology, this image right here simply wouldn't exist for us to see today. This stunning rendering from Frank Gehry's Lewis residence, a true landmark of digital design, only survives because a digital archaeologist was able to navigate that entire chain of lost languages to pull it from a decades-old disk.
One of the pioneers we looked at earlier, Shui Yo, said it best. He said, "Dead or alive, the computer decides." Now, he was talking about how computers could verify if his designs would physically stand or fall. But his words have taken on this second, much deeper meaning today. The very survival of his own creative work is now completely at the mercy of technology.
And this goes so far beyond just architecture. We are talking about the first digital novels, the source code for groundbreaking software, early electronic music, critical scientific data, everything. Without this painstaking work, the very origin story of our digital world risks becoming a digital dark age, just lost forever. And all of this leaves us with a huge question. Think about it. Every photo we take, every document we write, every piece of art we create is born digital. We are creating more historical records right now than at any other point in human history. But who's going to make sure it all survives for the future? Who are going to be our digital archaeologists?